안녕하세요. 저는 Ben이에요. Today I wanted to make a new type of video. First of all, saying Happy New Year's. I've been learning Korean for a little bit over a year now, and for some of you, maybe you want to start learning Korean in the new year. So I wanted to share about all of the different ways that I've practiced and tips that I could give to hopefully help you on your Korean learning journey. The first tip that I want to talk about isn't necessarily practical, as most of the other tips will be in this video. One of the most important things I think that has been helpful to me is to have a clear motivation when learning Korean, because then you will be able to persevere and endure when it gets difficult, because it will get difficult. So if you have a clear motivation of why you want to learn, no matter how small or big it may be, keeping that motivation in mind is very important to help you continue practicing every day to reach your goals. I started learning Korean through textbooks. The first textbook that I used was called Korean Made Simple with Go Billy. I really liked this textbook because it's written from a native English speaker who then learned Korean, so then he kind of knows the position that you're in learning Korean and is able to teach in that specific way. Along with that textbook, or that series of textbooks, I also picked up Talk to Me in Korean textbooks level 1 through 10. I'm currently on level 6, but I think it is important to have multiple resources to draw from when learning Korean, because oftentimes different resources explain grammatical concepts or just the language in a different way that may help you understand. Sometimes as I've moved through all the different textbooks, it's been difficult to remember all the different grammar concepts and whatnot, and then when I have to remind myself, I have to try and find the place in the book that grammar form or whatever is talking about. But one tip that I can give is writing those grammar forms or those concepts down on note cards. Then the note cards, they're much easier to reference, to find, much easier to practice and test yourself with and study. At least that's what I've found with mine. So I've written down all the different grammar forms and grammar concepts on note cards for me to reference and practice with. An important aspect of learning any new language is the vocabulary, and that's no different with Korean. There's many different ways that you can practice vocabulary. I started off with note cards, like with the grammar forms, but that quickly got out of hand with just so many different vocab words. It was just impractical to have them all on note cards. So I currently use the program called Anki, which is really handy because it, as you practice, it keeps track of words that you have found difficult or words that you have found easy. Then you'll get them more or less frequently depending on how successful you are at those different words. I really like Anki as it kind of just sets up what I need to review for the day, and then I can just easily go into the program and practice those words, practice new words, and it keeps track of which ones I need to practice more or which ones I don't need to practice anymore. So beyond just reading textbooks and learning vocabulary, it's very important to put those things into practice. And one thing that I have done to put them into practice is by keeping a Korean journal, daily journal, in which I write down just Korean sentences about my life, and intentionally trying to use grammar forms and vocabulary that I've been learning recently so that I can retain them a bit better. So each day I typically write 10 different sentences in Korean that use the grammar forms that I need to review or vocabulary that I have just learned, to put them into practice. One good thing about journaling is you're able to form sentences in your head without a time constraint, which isn't the case when you're in conversation. In conversation, there's a bit of, pressure of just like talking to the other person. But with journaling, you can sit down and think as long as you need to make sure that you're getting the correct form and the correct placement of all the different words and whatnot, to make a correct natural sentence, which in conversation isn't usually the case. So I've found that the more that I journal, the more practice I get forming sentences, the better I become when speaking in Korean in conversation. So mostly what I've talked about has been purely reading and writing, which for the most part, at least for me, has come the easiest as opposed to listening and speaking. So here are some of the ways that I have practiced my listening skills and speaking skills. The first is to just consume a lot of Korean, listening to it. And there's, countless different ways that you can consume Korean. But some of the ways that I've done it, that's probably the way many people do it, is through music, and of course listening to the music, but actually taking time to deliberately try to understand what they're saying, and even sitting down and reading the lyrics, trying to understand them and translate them as a practice tool beyond just listening to them. Similarly, there's Korean movies and TV shows, and these you can find on Netflix, or some of the movies are on other streaming platforms, but the one that I use most is called Viki, which has many different Korean as well as other Asian TV shows. One cool thing about Viki is that you can enable like a learning tool when you watch the Korean dramas. What it will do is put the Korean subtitles as well as English subtitles paired together so that you can read along with both. And at any point, you can select one of the words that you may not understand or that you want a definition for, and then it'll give you the definition for that. So I have found that really helpful. A similar program that is a Chrome extension, is called Learning Languages with Netflix. So it basically does the same thing, where it gives the Korean subtitles as well as the English subtitles, and then you can select the different words to get definitions for them, and you can just read along, so that you're engaging with your reading skills as well as your listening skills. So that's both with Viki and Netflix. In addition to just watching and listening to the Korean dramas, one good way to practice your speaking is to do mimicking or shadowing, basically where you just listen to how the native speaker, the actor or actress, is saying a phrase, and then you repeat after them and try to sound the same, making the same pronunciation and intonation and whatnot.
행복하자.
행복하자. In addition to music and movies and TV, there's also YouTube, which has a vast variety of different Korean channels, both ones that focus on educational Korean, like teaching or learning Korean, but then there's all of the Korean creators that just have YouTube channels that you can just, watch their YouTube channels when they speak in Korean, which is just another way to expose yourself to new vocabulary or different topics that maybe you wouldn't find on the educational Korean channels. The way that I first started practicing my speaking in Korean was just talking to myself. So I do have Korean friends, but all of them live in Australia or Korea, so I don't actually have any Korean friends here where I live. So I want to practice Korean speaking, so what I did was I would just go out and walk my dog Pete and talk to myself in Korean while I walked the dog. So I would talk about what I observed, what I was seeing around me, or anything that I was thinking about, or just practicing the Korean lessons that I was learning, or basically just any way that to practice speaking, I would do it while I walked my dog. So this was about 30 minutes every day where I would just try and speak in Korean while I walked my dog. Another way that I have practiced my Korean speaking skills is by recording myself and making Korean practice vlogs, which you may or may not have seen on my channel already. So these are basically just dedicated time where I speak in Korean, practice speaking, and it's also a way for me to listen back to myself to then pinpoint areas where I need to improve in my pronunciation, or in my grammar, or bad speaking habits that I have in Korean, or whatever. But basically, I can watch back and then improve. And not only will watching them back help me see all the mistakes that I've made, but it'll also be encouraging when I watch them later in the future to see how far my skills have developed, because oftentimes, at least for me, it can be discouraging not seeing or not noticing the progress that has been made. So making these recordings of myself, I can then look back and see how much I've actually improved over a period of time. But without a doubt, the most effective and best way that I've improved my Korean speaking is with a language partner. So I found my language partner through an app called Tandem, but there are many other apps that you could use, or maybe you already have Korean friends that you can talk to. But finding somebody who's willing to practice Korean with you has been the biggest help for me. So we talk every Saturday night for 2 hours on the phone, and for the first hour we speak in Korean, and for the second hour we speak in English, and we're able to help each other with our pronunciation or any mistakes that we make in our speaking. We can correct them in real time, and then implement those corrections or those changes immediately, so that we're not building up bad habits as we speak. In addition to speaking every week, we also are able to ask each other questions throughout the week as we're learning English and Korean, questions that we have about grammar or pronunciation, or maybe just not understanding a phrase or something that we've heard. We're able to ask those things to get feedback directly, which can't really happen any other way through the textbooks or through the dramas or anything. There's no way to get that feedback. So having a language partner can be extremely effective in improving your other ways of practice as well. One example of that is even through my journal. I send those sentences that I write to my language partner, and they're able to correct them and help me figure out better and more natural ways to write those sentences. So then I'm not only practicing with my journal, but then I'm improving because they're giving me feedback on that practice that I'm getting. And beyond all the practice that I get with my Korean partner, it's just really good to have a Korean friend who I can talk to and learn from and listen to, who I know personally. So finding a language partner has without a doubt been the best thing for my Korean learning. So these are all of the ways in which I have practiced and improved in Korean over the year and few months that I've been studying Korean. If you do decide to learn Korean this new year, I wish you all the luck, and hopefully some of these tips will be helpful to you. 화이팅!